On May 13th, 1985, nearly 500 police officers converged on a house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to arrest several of the occupants. By the end of the day, 11 people would be dead, and approximately 65 houses burned to the ground. The occupants of the house were members of an organization called MOVE. Founded in 1972, the commune embraced several ideologies, including black nationalism, environmentalism, animal rights, and a wish to return to a hunter-gatherer society. They also stated their opposition to science, medicine, and technology. The organization's founder, a man named John Africa, named the group not as an acronym, but by stating that, quote, "Everything that's alive moves. If it didn't, it would be stagnant, dead." Like many of the group's members, John Africa wore his hair in dreadlocks, in keeping with the Caribbean Rastafari religion. His fellow MOVE members also changed their surname to Africa, in reverence to what they considered as their true home. By 1978, the group had moved into West Philadelphia. They proceeded to anger their neighbors by staging numerous loud public demonstrations for racial justice, animal rights, and other causes. They would often employ a bullhorn and demonstrate at all hours of the day. This did not go down well with their new neighbors, who complained to the city. It did not take long for MOVE to attract the attention of law enforcement. Mayor Frank Rizzo was a former police commissioner, and his contempt for activist groups was no secret, and he maintained a close eye on the group. 1 year earlier, 3 MOVE members were jailed for inciting a riot, resulting in further protests and show of armed force. The Philadelphia Police Department obtained a court order for MOVE to vacate their property after a series of complaints by neighbors. Members of the group agreed to vacate the premises and surrender their weapons, but only if police released their comrades from jail. By August 8, 1978, not all MOVE members had left the house. When police attempted to enter the house, a shootout started. A policeman named James Ramp was killed by a shot to the back of his neck. 16 police and firefighters were also injured in the firefight. MOVE blamed the police for Ramp's death. They claimed he was facing the house when he was shot, and insisted he was killed by his fellow officers. Prosecutors were having none of it, saying that MOVE fired the fatal shot, and charged 9 members with his death. Known as the MOVE 9, the members were charged with third-degree murder and were each sentenced to a maximum of 100 years in prison. In 1981, the group moved to a house at 6221 Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia. They started to make themselves at home by piling up trash and waste around the building. It was a mess. Neighbors were constantly complaining to the authorities about the group. Events finally came to a head on Monday, May 13, 1985. The police obtained arrest warrants for 4 of the house's occupants, with charges ranging from parole violations, contempt of court, illegal possession of firearms, and making terrorist threats. Mayor Wilson Goode and Police Commissioner Gregor Sambor classified MOVE as a terrorist organization. Police evacuated residents of the area from the neighborhood. Residents were told they will be able to return the next day. Nearly 500 police officers arrived at the scene to help serve the warrants. Water and gas to the MOVE house were shut off in an attempt to get the occupants to come out. Commissioner Sambor addressed the group, stating, quote, "Attention MOVE, this is America. You have to abide by the laws of the United States." This was met with no response from the group members. The police decided to get the show on the road and forcibly remove the organization from the house. Inside the house were 13 people, including 6 children. An armed standoff occurred. Police began lobbing tear gas grenades at the building. MOVE responded with gunfire. This went on for 90 minutes. Police used more than 10,000 rounds of ammunition before the commissioner decided on a different strategy. He was going to bomb the compound. In flew a Pennsylvania State Police helicopter, and police dropped 2 one-pound bombs of Tovex, a dynamite substitute supplied by the FBI, on the roof of the house. It was an attempt to disable a concrete bunker that had been built on the roof. The resulting fire killed 11 members in the house, including leader John Africa and 5 children aged 7 to 13. The fire, fueled by large amounts of gasoline stored in Move's compound, spread quickly and eventually destroyed 65 other houses on Osage Avenue and nearby Pine Street. Officials held back firefighters as they feared the Move members would shoot at them. In the aftermath of the incident, Police Commissioner Sambor resigned, although not until 6 months later. Mayor Good appointed an investigative commission, also known as the Move Commission. It issued its report on March 6, 1986. It denounced the actions of the city government, stating that, quote, dropping a bomb on an occupied row house was unconscionable. Following the report's release, Mayor Good issued a formal public apology, although nobody from the city government was criminally charged. He was re-elected in 1987. Ramona Africa, the sole surviving adult from the attack, was charged and convicted on charges of riot and conspiracy. She served 7 years in prison. In 1996, a federal jury ordered the city to pay a $1.5 million civil judgment to Ramona Africa and the relatives of 2 people killed in the bombing. The jury had found that the city used excessive force and violated the members' Fourth Amendment rights, the protection against unreasonable search and seizure. It wasn't until 2005, 20 years after the bombing, that residents displaced by the widespread destruction were compensated by the city of Philadelphia. A jury awarded them $12 million. It's 1921, and a group of West Virginia coal miners are about to go to war with their employers. A war fought not at the bargaining table, but with rifles and shotguns, in the largest armed uprising since the Civil War. Coal mining has been the lifeblood of West Virginia since the early 1800s. By the late 1880s, the coalfields in Mingo, Logan, and McDowell counties operated under a repressive system. Miners lived in company towns, in houses built and owned by the local coal company. Workers mined using tools leased from their employers, and were paid low wages, not in dollars, but a company currency called scrip. These vouchers could only be used, not surprisingly, in local stores also built and owned by the coal company. In the rare instance that the miners received a wage increase, the company store would simply increase their prices. This form of indentured servitude meant that, without any real money, coal miners could not easily just leave and look for work elsewhere. Working conditions were often dangerous. Despite the efforts of groups such as the United Mine Workers, mining companies had managed to keep unions out of the region, mainly through intimidation and violence. Companies made workers sign so-called yellow dog contracts, pledging not to organize, and they used private detective firms to harass striking miners and evict them from their company-owned homes. In 1920, the United Mine Workers finally started to organize workers in Mingo County. Members of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency arrived in the town of Matewan to evict union miners from houses owned by the local coal company. At the train station, the detectives were intercepted by the town's mayor, Cabell Testerman, and chief of police, Sid Hatfield, both men sympathetic to the miners. What originally started as a verbal argument quickly escalated into a shootout. What the detectives didn't know was that armed miners were watching on from windows and roofs of businesses lining the street. A gun battle ensued, which claimed the lives of 10 people, including 7 detectives and Mayor Testerman. The Matewan massacre galvanized support for the United Mine Workers. The coal companies responded by bringing in non-union replacement workers, and both sides engaged in a fierce guerrilla war. In 1921, the Mingo County Sheriff wrote, quote, "Murder by lying in wait and shooting from ambush has become common." On August 1st, 1921, Sid Hatfield was ordered to stand trial in anti-union McDowell County. Acquitted of murder charges stemming from the Matewan massacre, he was standing trial for conspiracy when he was ambushed on the courthouse steps by members of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Hatfield's murder outraged the miners, who considered him a hero for his role in Matewan. A march on Mingo County was organized by United Mine Workers leaders Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney. Determined to confront the coal companies and free imprisoned miners, many of the marchers were World War I veterans, armed with Springfield rifles and shotguns. The route took the miners through Logan County, another coal company stronghold. The sheriff, a man by the name of Don Chafin, was anti-union and organized an army of 3,000 men made up of state police, sheriff's deputies, and militiamen. Things had gotten so out of hand that Governor Ephraim Morgan asked President Warren Harding to intervene. Harding told him it was a state matter and the federal government would not get involved, but sent General Harry Bandholtz to meet Keeney and Mooney. Bandholtz told them to call off the march and told them that any violence would look bad for the Union and they would be held responsible. By August 24th, an estimated 13,000 miners had gathered to march on Logan County. By now, both Keeney and Mooney had fled, with the miners now under the leadership of Bill Blizzard. Meanwhile, Sheriff Chafin had begun to set up defenses on Blair Mountain, a 2,000-foot tall peak that stood between his forces and the oncoming miners. By August 28th, miners were trading gunfire with Chafin's forces. To distinguish themselves in the dense forest, the miners wore red handkerchiefs around their necks, becoming known as the Redneck Army. A group of around 75 miners stumbled upon some of Chafin's Logan defenders on a wooded ridge. Each side asked the other for a password, but received the wrong answer, prompting a firefight that killed 3 sheriff's deputies and 1 miner. Miners streamed up the mountainside, but despite their superior numbers, were repeatedly driven back by heavy machine gun fire. On September 1st, miners looted a Gatling gun from a nearby company store and engaged Chafin's forces once more for 3 hours. Miner Ira Wilson later recalled, quote, "Machine guns cracked up there so you would think the whole place was coming down on you." Sheriff Chafin upped the ante by chartering 3 biplanes and dropped tear gas and pipe bombs on the advancing miners. The explosives were dropped over 2 of the miners' strongholds, but failed to inflict any casualties. After initially declaring that the battle was not a federal matter, President Harding eventually sent in federal troops, and by September 4th, the miners surrendered to the army. Later, it was estimated that 1 million rounds had been fired during the battle. Reports of casualties ranged from between 20 to 100 deaths. In the short term, the Battle of Blair Mountain was a crushing defeat for the miners. Keeney, Mooney, and some 20 other men were charged with treason by the state of West Virginia, with hundreds of others indicted for murder. Most were acquitted, but the legal battles emptied the coffers of the United Mine Workers. It wasn't until the middle of the 1930s when President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation enabled the Union to once again organize in West Virginia. On August 21st, 1992, an 11-day siege began between an Idaho family and agencies of the U.S. government. By the time it was over, 2 family members and a U.S. Marshal would be killed, and the government's conduct would come under heavy scrutiny. In 1984, Randy and Vicki Weaver bought an isolated cabin on Ruby Ridge in Idaho, approximately 30 miles, 48 kilometers from the Canadian border. A former factory worker and Green Beret, Randy moved his wife and 4 children to escape what they saw as a corrupt world. A few years earlier, Vicki had recurring dreams of living on a mountaintop and believed the apocalypse was imminent. Shortly after arriving in Idaho, Randy Weaver and a neighbor called Terry Kinnison got into a dispute over land. Kinnison lost the lawsuit and was ordered to pay court costs and damages. This loss did not go down well with Kinnison, who responded in the only rational way possible. He wrote letters to the FBI alleging that Randy had threatened to kill notable figures such as Pope John Paul II, President Ronald Reagan, and Idaho Governor John Evans. In addition, the Secret Service were told that Randy was a member of the Aryan Nation and had a large cache of weapons at his residence. When interviewed by the Secret Service and the FBI, Weaver admitted that, yes, he had attended a handful of meetings at the local Aryan Nation compound, but was not a white supremacist. Fast forward to 1986, and Randy Weaver is now under the scrutiny of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms. While at a meeting at the World Aryan Congress, Randy had been invited there for the first time, he was introduced to a confidential ATF informant. The informant was undercover as a weapons dealer for motorcycle gangs. They met several times over the next 3 years. In October of 1989, the ATF claimed that Randy sold 2 sawed-off shotguns to the informant. The length of the guns was shorter than allowed under federal law, making them illegal. The following year, the ATF attempted to use a sawed-off shotgun charge to get Weaver to act as an informant against the Aryan nation. Randy told them to get lost. Not one to take rejection lightly, the ATF filed the gun charges and also alleged that Weaver was a bank robber with criminal convictions. This was untrue. He was indicted by a federal grand jury for making and shortening, but not selling, the shotguns. After deciding it was too risky to arrest Weaver at his residence, the ATF concocted a scheme whereby agents would pose as broken-down motorists. Randy and Ricky obligingly stopped to help them, and Randy was promptly arrested. What happened next was mass confusion. The trial date was changed from February 19th to February 20th. The court sent letters notifying all parties of this change, but Weaver's notice was sent not to him, but instead to his case-appointed attorney. Weaver's probation officer sent him a letter stating that the trial was in fact March 20th. The attorney sent letters to Weaver stating that no, the trial is still February 20th, but did not hear back. When Weaver failed to appear on February 20th, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Despite receiving a copy of the letter with the incorrect court date, the judge refused to rescind the warrant. On March 14th, the U.S. Attorney's Office called a grand jury, but failed to provide a copy of the probation officer's letter to them. Without this evidence, the grand jury voted to indict Randy Weaver for failing to appear in court. Now considered a fugitive, Weaver's case was passed over to the U.S. Marshals. From March to August 1991, they tried to negotiate Randy's surrender, but he refused to leave his cabin. The government's patience wore thin, however, and negotiations ceased on October 12, 1991. Nothing much happened until April 18, 1992, when the media reported that shots had been fired at a helicopter flying over the Weaver property. It was alleged that Weaver had taken shots at the helicopter. Hired for the Geraldo Rivera show, now it can be told. The reports were denied by both Weaver and the US Marshals, who just happened to be near the property installing surveillance cameras. The helicopter's pilot also said that Randy Weaver did not fire at him. On August 21, 1992, the siege at Ruby Ridge began. 6 US Marshals dressed in camouflage and using night vision goggles scouted the area outside the Weaver cabin. One of the Marshals threw 2 rocks at the cabin to test the reaction of the family's dogs. This got the attention of the dogs, Randy Weaver, his 14-year-old son Sammy, and family friend Kevin Harris. They left the cabin to investigate, while the Marshals retreated to a location 500 yards, 460 meters, west of the cabin. Randy encountered the Marshals there, and 2 of them identified themselves, telling Randy to back off. About a minute later, Sammy and his yellow Labrador Retriever, Striker, appeared out of the woods. When the Marshal's position was revealed by the dog, Deputy U.S. Marshal Art Roderick shot the dog dead. Sammy Weaver then told the Marshals, "You shot my dog," and fired a shot in the vicinity of Roderick. Marshal Larry Cooper then fired towards Sammy and Kevin Harris, who sought cover behind a tree stump. He returned fire, killing Marshal Bill Deegan. Sammy, now retreating up a hill, was shot in the back and killed by Cooper. In the aftermath of the gunfight, U.S. Marshals requested the help of both the Idaho State Police and the FBI, as a U.S. Marshal had been killed. The following day, the FBI drafted special rules of engagement for Ruby Ridge, including: if any adult in the area around the cabin is observed with a weapon after their surrender announcement had been made, deadly force could and should be used to neutralize the individual. If any adult male is observed with a weapon prior to the announcement, deadly force can and should be employed if the shot could be taken without endangering any children. If compromised by any dog, the dog can be taken out. Any subjects other than Randy Weaver, Vicky Weaver, Kevin Harris presenting a threat of death or grievous bodily harm, FBI rules of deadly force apply. Deadly force can be utilized to prevent the death or grievous bodily injury to oneself or that of another. In later interviews, several snipers believed these rules constituted a shoot-on-sight policy, while Fred Lansley, the FBI hostage negotiator, was, quote, surprised and shocked at these rules, the most severe rules he had heard in more than 300 hostage negotiations. He later characterized the rules as being inconsistent with standard policy. Before the negotiators could arrive at the cabin, FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi shot and wounded Randy in the back from over 200 yards away. Randy was about to enter the shed to visit the body of his son Sammy. As Weaver, his 16-year-old daughter Sarah, and Kevin Harris ran to the cabin, Horiuchi fired another shot, wounding Harris in the chest. This shot also killed Vicky Weaver, who was standing behind the door holding her 10-month-old baby. The standoff continued. Civilian negotiators arrived, with whom Randy Weaver was willing to talk. On August 30th, a badly wounded Kevin Harris surrendered, and he was stretchered to hospital. The next day, Weaver and his daughters surrendered. Both Weaver and Harris were arrested and charged with a variety of offenses. The trial began in April 1993. The famed defense attorney Jerry Spence rested his case without calling any witnesses. Instead, he sought to convince the jury through cross-examination in an attempt to discredit the government's evidence and witnesses. In July, Weaver was acquitted of all charges, except two: missing his original court date and violating his bail, for which he served 18 months and a $10,000 fine. He served less than 16 months. Kevin Harris was acquitted of all charges. On August 21, 1997, he was indicted for the first-degree murder of U.S. Marshal Bill Deegan by the local Idaho prosecutor. However, this was thrown out on the grounds of double jeopardy, as he had been acquitted of the same charge during his federal trial. The actions of the government agencies at Ruby Ridge came under intense scrutiny. The Department of Justice created the Ruby Ridge Task Force to investigate, and delivered a 542-page report on June 10, 1994. The Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Technology, and Government Information held 14 days of hearings on the incidents at both Ruby Ridge and the subsequent siege at Waco. Both the subcommittee's report and that of the Ruby Ridge Task Force criticized the rules of engagement, claiming that they were unconstitutional. Randy Weaver and his daughters filed a wrongful death lawsuit for $200 million. In August 1995, the federal government awarded Randy $100,000 and paid his three daughters $1 million each. Despite the settlement, the government denied any wrongdoing regarding the deaths of Vicky and Sammy Weaver. Kevin Harris also sued the government, although federal officials said they would never pay someone that had killed a federal agent. He ultimately received $380,000. Lon Horiuchi, the sniper responsible for killing Vicky Weaver, was indicted for manslaughter by a federal court, but the case was dismissed. The decision was then overturned by the United States Court of Appeals, but the newly elected local prosecutor also decided to drop the case, stating that it would be difficult to prove the charges and that, quote, too much time had passed. Randy Weaver passed away on May 11, 2022, at the age of 74.